The $5 coin was the last thing he had. It was worn smooth, the lady's face nearly erased by a decade of worry and calloused thumbs. Caleb gripped it in his pocket, the metal a cold stone against his skin. He'd come to the town of Redemption for salt and flour, maybe a sack of feed if the mercantile owner was feeling charitable. Instead, he found himself at an auction, not for livestock or foreclosed land, but for a person. She stood on the splintered planks of the loading dock, a girl no older than 16, with eyes as dark and still as a desert night. Apache. Her hands were bound with a length of rough rope, her silence a fortress against the leering faces in the crowd. "A fine piece of salvage," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice slick with greed. "Hard worker, knows her place. Who'll start the bidding at $3? Caleb felt the ghost of a fire on his back, heard the phantom cry of a child's voice in the wind. He saw the men bidding, ranchers with cruel mouths and roving eyes, a saloon owner looking for cheap labor. They weren't bidding on a person, they were bidding on a tool, a thing. The bidding reached $4.50. The hammer was about to fall. Caleb's hand closed around the coin. He wasn't a hero. He was a ghost, a man who had already failed to protect the people he loved. But in the girl's stillness, he saw not surrender, but a terrifying, profound dignity. It was a mirror to the part of himself he thought had burned away with his home. He pulled out the coin. $5, he said. The words were quiet, scraped raw from a throat tight with dust and disuse. The crowd turned, their surprise curdling into scorn. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed. "Sold?" The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Caleb walked forward, the stares of the other men like brands on his skin. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a man who had just spent his last dollar on a second chance he didn't deserve, for a soul he had no idea how to set free. The silence that followed the transaction was heavier than the midday sun. Men who had been his rivals in the bidding now watched him with a possessive, predatory glint. Silas Blackwood, a rancher whose cruelty was as legendary as his land holdings, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's worn boot. It was a promise, a down payment on future violence. Caleb ignored him, his focus narrowed to the small figure before him. He used his pocket knife, the blade dull from mending harnesses, to saw through the rope binding her wrists. The fibers fell away, leaving angry red welts on her skin. She didn't flinch, she just watched him, her eyes unreadable. He held out his hand, not to lead her, but as an offering, a question. After a long moment, she stood, her movements fluid and economical, betraying none of the stiffness of her ordeal. She didn't take his hand. He hadn't expected her to. Together, they walked away from the auction block, a procession of two outcasts. The whispers of the townsfolk followed them, clinging like burrs. "Paid $5 for that? Heard he lost his wife and kid. Guess he's looking for a replacement." Caleb's jaw tightened. They knew nothing. They saw a transaction, a purchase. They didn't see the ghost of his daughter, Sarah, in the girl's defiant posture. They didn't feel the weight of the $5 coin, not as currency, but as an act of penance. His horse, a weary old mare named Dust, waited patiently at the edge of town. There was no wagon, no buggy, just one saddle. He untied his canteen from the horn. "Water?" he offered, his voice still rough. She stared at the canteen, then back at him. Her gaze was an interrogation. He understood. Every kindness she had ever been shown probably came with a price. He unscrewed the cap and drank first, a long, slow swallow, then held it out again. She watched him for another beat, then took it, her fingers barely brushing his. She drank, her throat working, but her eyes never left his face. When she was done, she handed it back. Not a word, not a nod. Just the simple, profound act of accepting a drink. The journey back to his ranch was a long one, and the silence between them stretched out, a vast and empty landscape all its own. The ride was a slow, rhythmic sway, a silent pilgrimage across a cracked and thirsty land. The sun beat down, bleaching the color from the sky, turning the distant mesas into hazy, lavender ghosts. Caleb walked, leading Dust, while the girl rode. He had offered her the reins, but she'd only stared at them as if they were a trick she didn't understand. So he led, the cracked leather a familiar weight in his hand, his boots scuffing up clouds of red dust that settled on everything. In the suffocating quiet, his thoughts grew loud. Memories he spent his days tamping down now rose like smoke. He saw his wife, Lena, her hands covered in flour, laughing in the kitchen of a cabin that was now just a collection of charred timbers. He saw his daughter, Sarah, her hair the color of corn silk, chasing butterflies in a field that was now overgrown with thistle and sorrow. A fire. Not a wildfire, but a stupid, senseless accident with a lantern. He had been in town buying seed. He came back to a nightmare, the orange flames licking at the night sky, a monument to his absence. He had failed to be there. The one time it mattered most, he was gone. Now, glancing back at the girl on his horse, he felt the old wound tear open. She was as silent and contained as he was, a vessel of unspoken grief. He tried to fill the space between them with words. "It's not much farther," he said, his voice swallowed by the immense quiet. She didn't respond. Later, he pointed. "That's Crow Peak. My father used to say you could see the whole world from up there." Her eyes followed his finger, lingered for a moment on the jagged silhouette, and then returned to the path ahead. It was like talking to a stone, but he kept trying, because the silence was too much like the silence of his own empty home. As dusk began to bleed across the horizon, they stopped to make camp. He built a small, smokeless fire, a skill he'd learned out of necessity. He offered her a piece of jerky. She refused. He set it on a flat rock near her, then moved back to his side of the fire, giving her a wide berth. Hours passed. The stars emerged, cold and brilliant. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She hadn't moved. Then, so slowly he almost missed it. Her hand crept out, and her fingers closed around the dried meat. She ate it in small, deliberate bites, her gaze fixed on the flames. It was a victory so small it was almost invisible. But for Caleb, it felt like the first drop of rain after a 5-year drought. The first sight of the ranch was not inspiring. It was a scar on the land, a testament to neglect born of grief. The cabin sagged, its porch listing like a ship taking on water. The fences were a tangle of broken posts and rusted wire. A single stubborn patch of corn grew near the well, a lonely act of defiance against the surrounding decay. This was his kingdom of sorrow, and he had just brought another soul into it. He watched the girl's face for any reaction, disappointment, fear, disgust. He saw nothing. Her expression remained a placid mask. She slid off the horse with a quiet grace and stood waiting, her small bundle of belongings clutched in one hand. "This is it," he said, the words tasting like apology. "It's not much." He led her to the cabin. Inside, it was spare and clean, if nothing else. A table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and his own bedroll in the corner. He had spent the morning before his trip to town clearing out the small storage room, sweeping away the dust and cobwebs. He'd laid down a clean, patched blanket on the narrow cot inside. He pushed the door open. "This is for you," he said, gesturing to the small space. It had a tiny window that looked out over the vast, empty expanse to the east. Privacy, safety. It was the only luxury he could offer. He placed a tin plate with another piece of jerky and a hard biscuit on the floor just inside the door, along with a cup of water. Then he backed away, pulling the main cabin door shut behind him. He didn't latch it. He wanted her to know she wasn't a prisoner. That night, Caleb didn't sleep in his bedroll. He took a blanket out to the listing porch and sat with his back against a post, his rifle across his lap. He was standing guard. Not against the coyotes or the mountain lions, but against the ghosts of his own past. He was guarding the memory of his failure, trying to keep it from seeping through the walls of the cabin to touch the girl inside. He was a protector who had arrived too late once before. He wouldn't let it happen again. Sometime in the deep, silent hours of the night, he heard a floorboard creak inside. He held his breath. The sound didn't come again, but in the morning, the plate was empty and the cup was dry. The days fell into a rhythm, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. There were no words, only actions. Caleb would rise before dawn, work until his muscles screamed, and fall into an exhausted sleep on the porch. He mended the fences, his hammer blows a steady, percussive beat against the silence. He cleared the field, pulling up thistle and rock, his sweat watering the barren ground. He was trying to bring the land back to life, and in doing so, maybe himself. The girl, whom he thought of only as the girl, was a silent observer. She would sit in the shade of the cabin, watching him. Her stillness was not idle, it was active, watchful. He'd leave food for her on the porch, a boiled potato, a piece of bread, and it would always be gone when he returned. One afternoon, he came back from the well to find a small, neat pile of his work shirts on the porch table. Each one had been mended, the tiers stitched together with a thread so fine and a hand so steady the repair was nearly invisible. He ran his thumb over the stitches. It was a message, the first she had sent. A quiet declaration that she was more than a bystander in this place. A few days later, he was trying to fix the stubborn handle on the water pump, cursing under his breath. He heard a soft sound behind him. She was standing there, holding out a small, flat piece of leather. She pointed at the loose joint, then at the leather. A shim. A perfect, simple solution he had been too frustrated to see. He took it, their fingers brushing for the second time. "Thank you," he mumbled. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and retreated back to her shade. He felt a ridiculous grin spread across his face. He was a grown man, a broken rancher, feeling triumphant over a nod. That evening, he sat by the fire, whittling. He wasn't an artist, but his hands were good with a knife. He carved the shape of a small quail from a piece of scrap pine. He smoothed the edges, etched in the feathers with the tip of his blade. The next morning, he left it on the porch railing, right where she would see it. When he came back for his midday meal, it was gone. He imagined her holding it, her fingers tracing the wooden feathers, and the thought was a small, warm coal in the cold hearth of his chest. The piece, fragile as it was not meant to last. One sweltering afternoon, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced their arrival. 3 riders. Caleb recognized the arrogant slump of the man in the lead. Silas Blackwood. He had come to collect on the promise his spit had made in town. Caleb's hand went instinctively to the axe handle leaning against the cabin. He didn't own a pistol, had sold it long ago for food. The rifle was inside, too far. He stood his ground in the middle of the yard as they rode up, their horses trampling his newly cleared patch of earth. Silas reined in his horse, looking down at Caleb with open contempt. His 2 men fanned out, their hands resting on their sidearms. "Heard you set up a little homestead here, Caleb," Silas said, his voice a low sneer. He surveyed the dilapidated ranch. Doesn't look like much. He spat again, this time narrowly missing Caleb's boot. We didn't come to talk about your farm. Silas's eyes slid to the cabin door. We came for our property. The one you stole at that auction. Caleb's blood ran cold, but his voice was steady. She's not property, and she's not yours. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. I was the high bidder before you threw your charity money down. That makes her my business. Now, you can hand her over easy, or we can make this hard. Your choice. Caleb thought of the fire, of his own helplessness. He thought of the neatly stitched shirts, of the small wooden bird. He had been a coward once, hiding from the world in his grief. But standing there, between this monster and the silent girl in the cabin, he felt something else. A flicker of the man he used to be, the man Lena had married. He took a step forward, putting himself directly between Silas and the porch. He wasn't a big man, and he was worn thin by hunger and hard work, but in that moment, he felt like a mountain. You're not touching her, he said. The words were quiet, but they echoed with the finality of a slamming door. Silas's smile vanished. That's the wrong answer, friend. He started to dismount, a clear threat of violence. But before his boot hit the ground, the cabin door creaked open. The girl stood there. She held Caleb's rifle. She wasn't pointing it. She just held it, its weight seeming to anchor her to the ground. Her eyes, fixed on Silas, were no longer still and deep. They were blazing. Silas froze, his eyes darting from the rifle to Caleb's defiant stance. He was a bully, not a fool. He wasn't prepared for two fronts. He swung himself back into the saddle, his face a mask of fury. This ain't over, he hissed. You and your pet are living on borrowed time. He yanked his horse's reins and galloped away, his men following close behind. Caleb stood watching until they were just another cloud of dust. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He turned. The girl was still standing in the doorway, the rifle held tight in her hands. She had protected him. They had protected each other. The dust from Silas's departure settled back onto the earth, but the tension remained, vibrating in the air like a plucked string. Caleb turned to face the girl in the doorway. He expected to see fear, or the same blank stillness as before. Instead, he saw a warrior. She lowered the rifle, her movements slow and deliberate, and leaned it against the doorframe. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he felt he was truly seeing her, not as a victim or a project, but as a person with a history and a strength all her own. He walked towards her, his legs unsteady. You were. Thank you, he stammered, the words inadequate. She watched his mouth as he formed the words. Then she spoke. Her voice was low, a little rough from disuse, like stones rubbing together in a dry creek bed. Anaba. It was just one word, her name. It landed in the quiet space between them with the force of a thunderclap. Anaba. It meant she returns from war. He repeated it, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. Anaba. A small, almost imperceptible nod was her reply. The dam of silence had broken. From that day on, the ranch began to truly change. It was no longer his ranch and her shelter. It became their place. Anaba showed him things his farmer's eyes had never seen. She pointed out the faint trails of deer, showed him which roots were good to eat, where the wild onions grew thickest. She knew the land's secrets. He, in turn, offered her his own language. He would point to an object, a hammer, a cup, the sky, and say the word. She would listen, her head tilted, and then repeat it, her pronunciation careful and precise. Their conversations were a patchwork of single words, gestures, and a shared understanding that ran deeper than language. One evening, As they sat by the fire, a comfortable quiet settled between them. The memory of the fire, the one that had defined him for so long, rose in his mind. This time, he didn't push it away. He spoke of it, the words tumbling out in a broken, halting confession. He told her about Lena. He told her about Sarah. He told her about being in town, buying seeds for a future that would never come. He spoke until his throat was raw, the story laid bare between them. Anaba listened, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When he was finished, his shoulders slumped with the weight of it all. She reached out and briefly, gently, touched his hand. It wasn't pity. It was acknowledgement, a shared understanding of loss. In that moment, he knew he wasn't just protecting her from Silas. He was fighting for his second chance to be there when it mattered. The town of Redemption had lived up to its name for Caleb in an ironic way. It had offered him a chance to redeem himself, but it would not offer him forgiveness. News of Silas Blackwood's humiliating retreat spread faster than a prairie fire. The story, however, got twisted in the telling. Caleb wasn't a man defending his home. He was a squaw man, an outcast who had sided with a savage against his own kind. When he rode into town for supplies a week later, the change was palpable. The mercantile owner who once offered him credit now claimed he was short on stock. Old acquaintances who used to nod a greeting now stared at the ground as he passed. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were a wall of hostility. He needed salt, flour, and cartridges for the rifle. He ended up at the sheriff's office, hoping for some semblance of law. Sheriff Miller was a man whose spine was made of jelly. He sat behind his desk, polishing a badge that was shinier than his sense of duty. "Look, Caleb," he said, not meeting his eyes. "Silas has a lot of friends in this county. Powerful friends. You went and stirred up a hornet's nest over that girl." "Her name is Anaba," Caleb said, his voice level. "And Silas threatened to kill us." The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound of practiced indifference. "What did you expect? You bought his property out from under him. As far as the law is concerned, this is a private dispute. You bought the trouble. You own it." The finality in the sheriff's tone was like a jail door slamming shut. He was alone. The town had drawn its line in the sand, and he and Anaba were on the wrong side of it. He rode back to the ranch with a near-empty saddlebag and a heavy heart. The world had shrunk to the size of his small, broken-down piece of land. He explained the situation to Anaba, using the few words they shared and gestures to fill in the gaps. She listened, her expression unreadable, but for the tightening of her jaw. They were isolated, besieged. They could run, disappear into the mountains, live off the land. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. Or they could stay. They could fortify the ranch, turn their home into a fortress, and make a stand. It was a fool's choice, a suicide mission. But as he looked at the home they had started to build together, the mended fences, the thriving corn, the quiet companionship, running felt like another kind of death. It felt like leaving his family behind all over again. What would you do? When the world demands you surrender the one good thing you have left, do you hand it over or do you fight? They chose to fight. The days that followed were a blur of desperate preparation. There was no grand strategy, only the grim calculus of survival. Caleb, using his farmer's knowledge of leverage and structure, reinforced the cabin door and boarded up the largest window, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. Anaba, using her warrior's knowledge of the land, disappeared into the surrounding hills. She returned with armfuls of thorny branches, which she used to create a hidden perimeter of natural caltrops along the main approach to the cabin. She showed him how to rig a tripwire, using old fence wire and a collection of empty tins that would rattle and clang if anyone stumbled through it. They worked together in a seamless, silent partnership, their movements anticipating one another's. They were no longer a man and a girl. They were a unit, a two-person army defending a nation of two. The attack came at dusk, the time of day when shadows grow long and treacherous. The rattling of the tins was their first warning. Caleb peered through a slit in the wall. Silas was back, and this time he'd brought 5 men with him. They were moving in a loose formation, rifles ready, their faces grim in the fading light. "Get down," Caleb whispered, pulling Anaba away from the doorway. The first gunshot splintered the wood of the cabin wall, inches from his head. The siege had begun. It wasn't a heroic battle from a dime novel. It was ugly, terrifying, and clumsy. Caleb was not a gunslinger. His shots were wild, aimed more to suppress than to hit, but his stubbornness was a weapon in itself. For every shot the attackers fired, he fired one back, making them pay for every inch of ground. Anaba was a ghost. She moved through the darkened cabin, reloading the spare rifle, pointing out the location of the attackers with a silent gesture, her calmness a steadying anchor in the chaos. One of Silas's men made a break for the cabin. He ran low and fast, but he didn't see the patch of thorny branches Anaba had laid. He cried out, stumbling, and Caleb's shot found its mark. The man went down. The others hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, Silas grew enraged. "He's just one man!" he roared, and charged forward himself. He reached the porch, kicking open the reinforced door. Caleb met him, swinging the empty rifle like a club. They crashed together, a tangle of desperate limbs. Silas was bigger, stronger. He forced Caleb to the floor, his hands closing around Caleb's throat. As Caleb's vision started to spot, he saw a movement behind Silas. It was Anaba. She held a heavy iron skillet from the hearth, and she swung it with all her might. The skillet connected with Silas's head with a sickening thud. He collapsed, unconscious. Suddenly, a searing pain exploded in Caleb's shoulder. One of the remaining men had fired through the doorway. Caleb cried out, clutching the wound as blood poured through his fingers. Anaba didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rifle and fired back into the darkness. A scream, and then the sound of retreating footsteps, and then silence. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing and the low moan of the wind through the bullet holes in the cabin walls. He was on the floor, propped against the wall, the world swimming in a haze of pain. His shoulder was on fire. Through the fog, he saw Anaba. She knelt beside him, her face a mask of fierce concentration. She ripped a strip of cloth from her own dress and pressed it hard against the wound, her small hands surprisingly strong. Her touch was not just medical, it was proprietary. He was hers to save. He looked past her at the unconscious form of Silas Blackwood on the floor and the darkness outside where the others had fled. They had won. It felt less like a victory and more like they had simply survived the storm. The sun rose the next morning on a scene of quiet devastation. The yard was littered with the evidence of the fight, the cabin scarred and broken, but it was still standing, and they were still in it. Anaba tended to his wound with a practiced skill that spoke of a life filled with hardship and healing. She cleaned it with boiled water and packed it with herbs she gathered from the hillside, her movements gentle but efficient. He watched her, this girl he had bought for $5, this woman who had stood with him against the world, and felt a wave of something so profound it almost buckled him. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a sense of belonging he thought he had lost forever in the ashes of his first life. A few days later, when he was strong enough to walk, he found her by the creek, washing the blood from the floorboards of the cabin. He stood beside her for a long moment, watching the water run pink and then clear. He didn't have another $5 coin. That was gone. But he had the ranch, or what was left of it. He had his life, which she had saved. He had a future, which she had given back to him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, the deed to the land. He had spent the morning carefully writing on the back of it, his hand shaking from pain and effort. He held it out to her. She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. On the back, in his clumsy handwriting, it said, "Half of this land and everything on it belongs to Anaba." She read the words slowly, her lips moving silently. Then she looked up at him, and for the very first time, he saw her smile. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it was like watching the sun rise after a lifetime of darkness. He hadn't bought a person at that auction. He had bought a chance to build a new family, to mend a broken spirit, to find redemption not in a town's name, but in the steadfast heart of another human being. They were two outcasts, two survivors, standing together on their small patch of earth, finally, truly home.